was young, I used to read a ton of books. I read whole series, like The Adventures of a Boy and His German Shepherd Scout during World War II. I felt excited when I returned from the library with a new stack of books. It was like that song the Oompa Loompas sing in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Once they start, oh boy, you watch the slowly growing joy that fills the heart. They'll grow so keen, they'll wonder what they'd ever seen in that ridiculous machine, that nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. In high school, I also read a lot, for fun, and my curriculum also required me to read a lot of books in different languages. But over time, I started to read less and less, even to the point of not picking up a book for months on end. I had to read a lot for my work, and I just didn't really feel like reading books in my leisure time. Plus, when I picked up my phone or I watched Netflix, it gave me that instant gratification. But I missed reading, being immersed in a story or learning new ways to improve my life. Reading books just has a depth that other mediums can't compare with. So a while back, I made a conscious decision to start reading again. But this time I would be more proactive about it and build a reading habit. And it worked. I've been reading a couple of books per month consistently over the last year, and there are a few things that have really helped me build up this reading routine. So if you're struggling to read more books, these things may help you become a more consistent reader too. So here are my 7 tips to read more books. I really like physical books. I like how they feel, I like how they smell, I like the fact that they're analog. I love going to bookstores and walk across the aisles to check out the new cookbooks, the novels, the biographies. But these days, I read all my books on an e-reader, and it has really helped me read more books. And here's why. So the first reason is it removes friction. It's light. I can bring this e-reader with me anywhere I go. And I have access to millions of books at any given time. I don't have to go to the bookstore, or I don't have to wait for a book to be delivered after I ordered it online. It's right here. And this also makes it easier to read multiple books at the same time, which I like to do. Like I often read a fiction book and a non-fiction book at the same time. When I'm done with the book, it doesn't take up space in my living space, so I can keep my living space minimal. And what I also like is I export highlights that I take in these books and import them into Notion, which is the basis for the book summary database that I'm building. More on that later. Something that's been holding me back in the past is this voice in the back of my head that told me, you have to read the classics, high literature, Ilias, Kafka, Dostoevsky. And I've read a lot of these books, and some of them are great. Others I just couldn't get through. And I realized something. Reading is a time investment. And why am I reading? It's for enjoyment, it's to learn new things, or to learn how I can improve my life. So anything that doesn't align with that, like why am I reading it? What matters is that I'm reading, not so much what I'm reading. I go through these different phases. Like I have phases where I read a lot of nonfiction, these self-help books. And after a while I'm done with that, I move on to fiction. I really start craving good stories. So, I've read books like The Lincoln Lawyer, and I'm not embarrassed to admit that I read like 15 John Grisham novels. And right now I'm reading the new book by Andy Weir. This book is called Project Hail Mary, and I'm absolutely loving it. So if you feel like, you're not reading enough, and at the same time you're telling yourself that when you read it has to be like high literature, like let go of that. What matters is that you're reading, not what you're reading. After hearing someone recommending it on a podcast, I picked up a copy of Steve Martin's book, Born Standing Up. I know Steve Martin mostly as an actor, most recently in the series Only Murders in the Building, which is about 3 neighbors that start a true crime podcast after someone gets murdered in the building. It's with Steve Martin, Selena Gomez, and I can't remember the name of the other actor. It's a great show. But in this book, the focus is on his stand-up career. So it starts with his early life, and then how he worked in Disneyland, picked up his first magic tricks, then starting to do shows here and there. And it ends with when he's at the peak of its fame in 1981. Now, I wanted to like this book. I really wanted to. The one thing I like the most is the quote at the very beginning of the book. I did stand-up comedy for 18 years. 10 of those years were spent learning, 4 years were spent refining, and 4 were spent in wild success. So it takes time to master skill. This is a valuable takeaway from the book. But as I kept reading, just little bits here and there, I never got into it. I felt there was, too much name dropping, too many details, Maybe this is super interesting if you're a hardcore Steve Martin fan or if you're an aspiring stand-up comedian yourself, but I'm neither. So after I was just dragging myself through the book and I was like midway, I decided to call it quits. And that's okay. Reading a book is a time investment. So it's important to be deliberate about which book you decide to read. And even when you do your due diligence, you may not know if you will actually resonate with that book until you actually read it. So it's great to quit a book, and when you do, you free up time to hit that subscribe button. And of course to move on to the next book, which could potentially change your life. When it comes to nonfiction, I often use sites like Blinkist or Shortform. Now this video is not sponsored by them, I actually use them, and sometimes the summary is enough, and other times when I feel the summary is sufficiently intriguing, I'll pick up a copy of the book. Now the problem with a lot of nonfiction books is they have this one core idea, which could have been a blog post. But instead the author put it in a 250-page book, so there's a lot of fluff. So what I do with these books is I won't put them away, I'll read them, but I will skim through it and highlight the things that matter the most. So I got this tip from Cal Newport, the author of Deep Work and Digital Minimalism. I heard it on his podcast and it has really helped me. Now, I like to read multiple books at the same time, often a fiction book and a non-fiction book. But because of that, it often can take a while before I finish a book, especially because, I have all other things going on in my life. I have my work, I have my social life, creating these YouTube videos. But when I'm like 75 to 80% done with a book, I will block a few hours to sit down, open the book and commit to finishing it right then and there. It doesn't matter how long it takes. I will not move on to other things until I'm on the last page. Now with a fiction book, that's especially easy because, I'm really invested in the story. I want to know how all the threads are weaved together at the end. And it feels good to finish a book. James Clear wrote in his book Atomic Habits, "Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you want to become." And every book that I finish is a vote for the person that I want to be, a consistent reader. So when do you read? I found that I can't just read 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there. I need some time to get back into the story or the point that the author is trying to make if it's a non-fiction book. So what I do is I schedule it. I read in the morning. It's part of my waking up routine. When I wake up, I like to walk around the block a little bit. And then when I come back, I make a matcha latte with almond milk, which is something I started doing recently because black coffee was a bit rough first thing in the morning. And then I read for 20-30 minutes until, I've read a couple of chapters and then I'm ready to start working. Then, depending on how my day has been, I'll read some more at night. Now, I'm not going to guilt trip myself into reading when I feel exhausted because I'm just depleted from work, but I try to read a couple of nights per week, a couple of chapters here and there. And they say it's a marathon, not a sprint. And that's the same with reading for me. I care more about consistency than about reading 100 books per month. And you can do the same, do whatever works for you. To make sure I actually read when I schedule it, I eliminate distractions. So for my phone, that means I make my phone very boring. It has a minimal theme, a black and white, just a couple of apps, definitely not social media, nothing that would normally distract me. It's on mute. And when I read, I put it in the bedroom so I can read without distraction in the living room. I also don't have a TV and I don't miss it. When there's a TV in my living space, even if it's not on, it's always there in my peripheral vision, quietly communicating to me, "Oh, turn me on. You haven't seen the last episode of Better Call Saul." And that's just not the case when there's no TV in the living space. I do watch things, but I watch them on my laptop and I have an external monitor that I normally use for work that if I really want to see something on a big screen, I can move it to the couch and put it on a coffee table behind me, but I rarely do. And this really helps when I'm reading, to stay focused and keep on reading. Finally, it really helps to read in a quiet environment. Now, luckily, my apartment is pretty quiet. I don't have any music on when I'm reading. In the past, I even used to go to libraries because I love how quiet it is there. It's like when you go into a gym, you just feel like exercising. When you go into a restaurant, you want to eat. When I go into a library, I feel like reading. I don't know about you, but the whole point of reading a book to me, besides enjoyment of course, is to amass knowledge and to build on that. I've read many books in my life, but if I'm honest, I don't remember much from most of them. And that just seems like such a waste. I've made highlights in paper books that I read, but I didn't really do much with them. But the cool thing about an e-reader is you can highlight and then export these highlights to a tool like Notion. And I've been using that to build a second brain. When I first learned about Thiago Forte's second brain, I got really excited about it. It's the system for storing, organizing, and eventually transforming information. I decided to start with a book notes database, and I always wanted to learn how to use Notion, so this just seemed like the perfect excuse to start playing around with it. So now I have this book database in Notion. For each book, I export the highlights and use that as a basis for my book review and summary. At this moment, I'm using Elizabeth Phillips' Notion template. What I like is her approach of having a maximum of 10 actionable takeaways. But at some point, I intend to create my own template. I had a phase where I wrote these super long summaries of books. I wanted to capture everything, and as a result, these summaries weren't really summaries. They were still half the size of the book. So what I like about these 10 actionable takeaways and capping it at that is that it really forces me to think about the specific aspects of a book that I really resonated with and write those down. So this is what my book summary database looks like right now. We have the title, the author, the date when the book was published, and then the year that I read it, my personal rating, what type of book it is, non-fiction or fiction, and then I add some tags so I can easily sort all the books that are about productivity, for instance. And then in the final column, I have added when I actually read this book. Now, when I open, these are all pages. So when I open one of these pages, this is where my actual book review is. So this is 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman, a book I really enjoyed. So what is the book about? The average person only lives about 80 years or 4,000 weeks. It's impossible to do everything we want in this limited time. Only when we come to terms with our finitude can we truly start living. That's really the essence of this book. Then I have my personal review, and these are 10 actionable takeaways from this book. Now I could write 50 actionable takeaways from this book, like I got so much value out of it. But these are the most important ones to me. And then I have a few favorite quotes. Now I'm still building this book summaries database. I have not added all the books that I've read over the last couple of years in this database yet. And for some of the books that I have added, like Mindset, for instance, by Carol Dweck, I've added in the details, but I haven't actually added the takeaways yet. So this is just what the template looks like right now. This is Elizabeth Phillips' template. But eventually I will take what I wrote down in a summary that I have in Google Docs here in Notion. I wish I had started building this database in my 20s, but the second best time to do anything is today. You don't have to build a Notion database like I did. But I think it's worthwhile to have some sort of record of the books that you read, with the key takeaways, your notes, the things you really resonated with, quotes you liked. I mean, you already did 95% of the work, right? It's not that much more time to write a few notes about the book. And yes, maybe you'll read 1 or 2 books less per year because of that. But instead of having all that knowledge just disappear over time, you now have this record of all the books that you read and the notes that you took. And then over a period of 10 years, this must be so cool. Like you can look back on it and see, wow, I was really into, this type of sci-fi books 8 years ago. And a couple of years later, the style that I was into really changed. The books I resonated with were different. And if you're a content creator, a database like this is golden. Like once it starts to build and build, you can really start cherry picking from it. Like I use ideas from books to make these videos on YouTube. And you can also start seeing how the ideas from these different books connect. As I said earlier, I try to incorporate reading into my evening routine. If you're interested in what a typical evening of mine looks like, I made a video about it called Evening Routine of a Slow Living Minimalist. In it, I talk about the novel Clara and the Sun by the Nobel Prize-winning British author Kazuo Ishiguro, a book I was reading at the time. I really enjoyed that one. You can check out that video right here. Thanks for watching, take care, and I hope to see you in the next one.